Radio Cairo English International Service presentes Special Program COP27 Egypt 2022.
To the listeners of Radio Cairo, I am Nicole Jungo El-Najjar from the Canary Island, and I present the speech of Charlotte Karibuhoye Said on the importance of the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which will take place in the city of Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt on November 6 to 18, 2022. Here is the speech. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this interview on Radio Cairo on the issue of climate change. My name is Charlotte Karibuhoye Said. I am from Burundi and I have lived and worked in West Africa for over 30 years. I have a background in veterinary medicine and conservation biology, and I am currently Regional Director of the West Africa Program of the MAVA Foundation, a Swiss philanthropic foundation that supports nature conservation and sustainable economy initiatives in African, Mediterranean and Swiss countries. In recent years, my work has focused on the preservation of natural and cultural heritage, with particular emphasis on developing multi-stakeholder partnerships for biodiversity conservation and sustainability issues. It is urgent to find solutions to climate change before it is too late. The latest report from the International Panel of Climate Experts clearly shows that we are in danger of rapidly reaching the point of no return. This question concerns us all. Intensive production methods and overconsumption contribute to exacerbating the effects of climate change. We are all challenged to take our responsibility, each at their own level, to implement sustainable and equitable solutions. Indeed, the consumption of the richest 1% is responsible for 15% of CO2 emissions, one of the main greenhouse gases and the main cause of global warming. The consumption of richest 10% is responsible for 50% of CO2 emissions. The consumption of the poorest 50% is responsible for only 10% of the CO2 emissions. Africa contributes less than 4% to greenhouse gas emission, and yet Africa is hit hardest by the effects of climate change. Africa and the Mediterranean are warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. Tackling climate change, therefore, means tackling inequality. The fact that this COP27 is organized in this great African nation of Egypt, and more particularly in the city of peace that is Sharm el-Sheikh, is very important and symbolic. My expectation from this COP is that it will be Africa's COP, which will allow not only to take into account the priorities of African countries, but also to recognize the significant efforts and know-how of populations and communities in the fight against climate change, and more particularly in relation to adaptation strategies. My message to Radio Cairo team, to the Egyptian people and to the participants of COP27 in Egypt is first of all a message of thanks to Egypt for hosting this great meeting. It is also a message of hope in relation to the result of this COP, but above all it is an appeal to everyone to contribute lasting solution to the climate burden will only come from our collective efforts in solidarity and justice. I thank Amira El-Khalili and Mohamed El-Kamel for the invitation and the entire Cairo radio team for enabling this dialogue of integration between peoples and nations around the world. Inshallah, Charlotte Karibuhoye Said.
To the listeners of Radio Cairo International, I am Jim Brown, an activist from Scotland, and I'm honoured to present this speech by Constantino Correia on the importance of the United Nations Conference on Climate Change, COP27, which will take place in the Egyptian city of peace, Sharm el-Sheikh, from the 6th until the 18th of November 2022. Here is his speech. First of all, I would like to thank Radio Cairo and its listeners. My name is Constantino Correia, a Guinean from Guinea-Bissau, West Africa. I am a forestry engineer, postgraduate in nature management and conservation. All my higher education took place in Portugal. I also took short courses in Morocco and Tunisia on environmental impact. I was twice the General Director of Forests and Wildlife, Chief of Staff to the Minister of Natural Resources and Energy, who also supervised the environment. I was Advisor to the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry Affairs. I was also responsible for facilitating two major projects with the main focus on rice production, among other such projects. I have also been very intransigent in denouncing several environmental crimes, the depletion of natural resources, especially forestry in my own country, Guinea-Bissau, events that occurred mainly in the period 2012 to 2014 during the period of transition after a military coup on April 12, 2012. The issue of climate and climate change is of growing concern and relevance for several reasons, mainly for Latin America and African countries, although they are responsible for the smallest share of greenhouse gas emissions, a fraction of the greenhouse effect. The African continent is one of the most vulnerable to climate change, a vulnerability increased by the high rate of poverty despite being countries extremely rich in natural resources. COP27 in Egypt will be a great opportunity for Africans and Latin Americans to prioritise demands on climate justice. The Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Mexican Patricia Espinosa, said, "We can do better. We need to." There have been pledges of funding of $100 billion per year until 2025 by the most developed countries to the least developed countries, which have so far shown no sign of compliance, while the problems of climate change become increasingly more evident. We have seen this year all over the world, but in Europe in particular, record temperatures, forest fires, heavy rains and storms. Clear signs of climatic and environmental disturbances that urgently need to be addressed. The Presidency's vision of the Climate Change Summit in Egypt focuses on the need to move from the realm of negotiations and planning to implementation, concrete actions and having a legacy from COP27. The expectation that the event be the turning point of global union that demonstrates the clear and necessary political will to address climate changes throughout concerted, collaborative and decisive actions. The choice of Egypt to host COP27 is a recognition and reward. It's a recognition of the commitment and efforts of the Egyptian nation as a whole, of the authorities, of civil society and of youth in particular in the search for solutions to climate change on the African continent. But it is also a clear sign of confidence in the ability of the Egyptian presidency of the continent to meet the expectations of the participants in the light of the current international challenges, as well as the objectives of the conference to achieve the necessary results that would strengthen the international action on climate change and achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change. Egypt, an ancient country, a pioneer in the emancipation of the African peoples, one of the first countries to gain independence in Africa, has provided and continues to provide significant material and financial support to many African and non-African countries in their independence and emancipation. Egypt, I bow to this great African resource. There is a worrying risk of a possible failure to meet the targets set by the Paris agreements, the main objective of which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to limit the average increase in global temperature to 2 degrees centigrade due to the current war in Eastern Europe, through which some European countries are experiencing gas supply difficulties, which may lead them to reintroduce coal and other sources into power generation to overcome these difficulties. If this were to happen, it would become very concerning, making it even more difficult to respect the Paris agreements and keep financial promises. I therefore call on the countries most directly affected by the events mentioned above to be much more sensible, to use all available channels to find a better solution for the supply of energy sources and thus respect the Paris agreements, also fulfilling funding pledges of $100 billion per year until 2025 as a contribution to least developed countries in Africa and Latin America to deal with extreme poverty and the consequences of climate change. Finally, I'd like to thank the listeners and staff of Radio Cairo International, and especially Mohammed El-Kamili and Amira El-Khalili for the opportunity of this interrogation between peoples and nations. Praise the Lord. Constantino Correia.